Hello and welcome to the session on Understanding Sensory with Katie Berg. I am the Supporting Neurodiverse Students Statewide Coordinator and
Karen Cromwell, occupational therapist, school-based for the last 21 years. So guys, we're going to dive in right away. And I just want to start out with the theory around everything being sensory. Yep, it is. Of course, everything is sensory because all living creatures are taking in and responding to what's happening around them all the time. Sensory processing and sensory integration can be interchangeable terms to describe the process that organizes sensation from your own body and the environment, and then makes it possible for us to, interact with it. Sensory integration is most often, in my experience, used as a way to describe intervention that supports sensory processing. And it's often a term that's used incorrectly, because what we really talk about is sensory integrative therapy. And that is a complex, multimodal, client-driven intervention that was developed and trademarked by AIRS, and it requires specialized training and certification. So what are we really doing on a day-to-day basis? Well, a lot of it is just sensory. So if you're interested in some of the most current research, we do have a lot of links that are available on the website or in your handouts, but right now we're just going to kind of drill down.
And what I'm hoping for those who are on the teacher side of things versus the OT side of things is start to cleaning up our language around how we talk about sensory. Because when you're talking to an OT, which me and Karen have known each other for years, we often have a lot of like, wait a second, are we talking about the same thing? We're saying the same words, but we're not talking about the same thing. And so we throw, as a special educator, I threw sensory around like willy-nilly, right? And I'm like, oh, we're going to do this sensory thing, or we're doing, right? And we need to move away from that and really understand what's going on within a child's body to be able to have them be able to access, engage, and progress in their education. Because that's the whole point of why we do special education within the settings that we're in an educational setting. So not only am I hoping that today we can clean up some of the language pieces, but also take a really deep dive in understanding what's going on and how our body is taking in information and what's it doing with it, and how it becomes sometimes a barrier moving on to be able to do something within school, and that access, engagement, and progress piece of an IEP.
And as school-based occupational therapists, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is helping people understand the difference between a true sensory behavior versus a behavior that is being observed for other reasons. And that's why we have to so specifically drill down and do those behavior analyses so that we gather the data to support what it is that we think needs to be done. Otherwise, we're just throwing something at the wall to seeing if it sticks.
So as we shift perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. I think we have to keep in mind that our language might be a little muddy, but we're really looking at switching from that idea that it's like sensory broken, or there's thing that it can affect in their sensory system, to what's the actual action and how do we get kids to be able to engage, to be able to access, engage, and progress in their education.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because we're all here because we're focusing on access to education, right? So as occupational therapists, and even possibly just within the educational venue itself, we often hear sensory processing disorder as just a presumed accepted thing. In the medical world, that's not actually the case. Sensory processing disorder is not recognized with the DSM-5 or the ICD-10. And these are the two most widely diagnostic sources in healthcare. This is key because when we're talking about a child's need, we really need to be focusing on their capacity to function within their real world. And sometimes we get stuck on the label of what it is, as opposed to the function or dysfunction that we're observing. And so talking about that functional performance and engagement includes considering all the variables that we kind of touched on in the last slide, about drilling down and understanding the true reason for that behavior that we're observing. Part of that is going to be all about the central nervous system and the brain function, and I'm going to geek out a little bit.
I love that you geek out about this too, because when I think about what is actually happening within a kid's actual body, there are so many layers, and that idea of the why and what's going on is so important. But to be able to get to that point, you have to know what you're drilling down to. So hopefully today, as we go through the different things that we have in this presentation, we will be giving you information so that when you go, why is this behavior output being seen and heard? You'll have some information to rely on to be able to go, it could be blah, 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 right? So hopefully you walk away with that. If not, feel free to email me and I'll help you walk away with that, because I hate when you go to a training and you don't actually get what they say you're supposed to get. So if that happens to you today, you have my email. You call me out on it. So let's start diving into what is actually going on with this whole sensory system.
All right, you guys. So most of us are going to be really familiar with at least the first 5 that are listed on this slide, right? We know about our visual system, our auditory or hearing, our tactile or our touch system. Our gustatory is that taste system. Vestibular is balance and how we orient in space. And olfactory is, of course, what we're smelling, right? And for the occupational therapists in the audience right now, feel free to roll your eyes. This is old news. We totally know this. But for other people, the next 2 are going to be perhaps surprising. And then for maybe a few people more, the last one will be. So we also have proprioceptive and vestibular senses. These are invisible internal senses, but they're really key to how we're able to function within our environment. They're key for balance and for where we are in space. And for those little ones that seem to just topple out of their seats or never be able to stand in line, we may be talking about some just vestibular or proprioceptive differences, and they just don't know where they are in space. Interoception is that last system that we're starting to see a lot more conversation about. When I'm talking to families about interoception or even school staff, I most often bring up the concept of toilet training, because it's not until our interoception is better evolved that we can even start to sense that we need to go to the bathroom. We start to understand that our grumbling stomach is telling us that we're hungry, or that our headache is telling us that we don't feel well. All of those are signs of our interoceptive sense or internal sense of self being able to communicate, so then we might be able to better regulate. So when we're talking about this context within schools, we're really talking about how we are going to be analyzing how a student is interacting with their environment to be able to access their education. And so to that end, we want them to engage, right? And we're talking about modulation or regulation. And so being able to engage is something that starts at a neurological level and then just kind of naturally develops for neurotypical individuals. But if you have sensory differences, or if you're an individual who has true sensory dysfunction that keeps you from being able to engage with your environment regularly, engaging with school can be pretty tricky, right? Because most of our brains are masters at filtering sensory information. Like, just take a moment right now and think, is there anything in the background that I'm naturally ignoring because this chick is cool and I really want to hear what she has to say? Because for me, that clock ticking might start to get a little bit louder if I'm pausing. I might hear somebody, scribbling notes, or if I'm a little dysregulated, I might notice some chewing because it gets to me. But the truth is, most of our brains can filter that stuff out. If my brain isn't working that way, though, then I'm more challenged, and it may be a lot trickier to be able to access what's happening in my classroom.
So when we think about what we can do within the classroom, I usually want to say these red flags right out here. We should not be trying to force anybody to taste new things, or actually, you're not going to force any sensory piece onto a child. Tolerance training is a medical strategy that we probably should not be doing without a trained person within it. So as a special education teacher, I'm not going to do tolerance training, try to get a child to be able to touch something they don't normally touch without having an expert with me. And that expert might actually be my school OT, right? But I'm not just going to bust into that kind of stuff, because it's a medical field type of things. And our OTs, that's what they're here for, right? And some of them will say, no, we're not even going to go down that route, right? Because either they're not trained and or it's not something that we can approach during school. So,
And Katie, I'd even add, like, sometimes it'll look like it's a particular kind of defensiveness or resistance, and in reality, it's a different system that's contributing altogether. And so unless you have the skills to really analyze what's happening, it's just tricky, because you might accidentally be triggering something that you didn't even realize was the true underlying issue. I think another piece that you and I really wanted to make sure was stated is that sense of smell. It doesn't have the same type of gateway that the rest of that sensory input has. It tends to go straight into our reaction mode as opposed to going through a filter. And so that sense of smell in particular can cause both positive and negative experiences to come up very unexpectedly, and sometimes unconsciously. The individual might not even understand that they've just smelled something that caused them to feel the way they're feeling. They just are reacting.
I think it's interesting. So we've all experienced the last couple of years, and how we've been doing so much more virtually, and the two senses that are primarily blocked or you don't have access to are smell and taste. And I'm not saying that everybody goes around licking people, but there is a piece to the chemical senses that we are missing because we are not standing in front of you right now. And the information you gain from that is so unconscious and straight to how you feel. It's that thing that a lot of people can't put their finger on with virtual learning or with meetings over Zoom. And I really, in my mind, I've noticed it a lot. And I don't go around licking people, but it is those two chemical pieces in combination that is completely cut off in this type of environment, and play a major role in being able to feel and what we describe as interactive and engagement. So know that even though we're doing a lot of stuff through computers now, there is information that you gain just from being in the physical presence of somebody else. And so if you're a teacher who loves your perfume and you're the one that child seems to not like because they're going after you all the time, it might not be about you. It might be about your smell. So it's maybe this year I don't wear my Estee Lauder. I put it to the, do people still wear that? I don't even know. I feel like that was something my sister wore, and like it's the bottle I can imagine in my head for perfume, right? Try not having that there.
Right.
So we don't add things in for smell and taste. We take things out. And so when we look forward and how we approach things for school-based interventions, for those two, they can go really wrong really fast. And so you definitely need somebody trained talking with you and interacting with you about what is going on within that student's system.
So we actually have a little bit more to talk about on that slide that you just clicked past.
Oh, do we?
We do.
Well, let's go back.
Sounds good. So you guys, the one thing that I don't think we really touched on is that this filter works really well, and Katie was just leading up to this, until the brain becomes overwhelmed. And then we kind of trigger into this dissonance of fight, flight, or shutting down, right? And so I totally said that wrong.
Fight, flight, or freeze.
There we go.
I got
Fight,
it.
flight, or freeze.
I hope they got it.
Oh my Lord. So anyway, we do have a lot of different areas of the brain that are predicting, selecting, organizing, and then moving sensory signals forward that come from within the body and the environment. The reason I really wanted to make sure we came back to talk about this is because prediction and expectation play a huge role in how sensory information is used. In context and anticipated outcome are going to determine what information needs urgent attention and reaches awareness. So for instance, if you've been in a car accident and you suddenly hear squealing tires, you may be more likely to be paying a lot of attention to what happened just over there, because that's something that triggers you. But if you've not had that negative experience, you might not be turning from driving forward safely, right? Because you're feeling confident that this is a safe environment for you. Much similarly, a child who hears a slamming door or a book dropping might be able to just move forward through it and not lose their attention, because they're not looking at those things or considering those things as a potential threat. Whereas other kids, for them, that might be really hard to move on from, because their sensory system is now at a point of high alert, and they have to ensure that they're safe first. Because if we're not feeling safe, our brains are not ready to learn.
Right. And when we think about that, moving from that sensory system, that idea of the different pieces that take in information for us and move into how our body actually uses it, that's where we live within education. Okay. We are not going to be able to, let me say this. Can sensory systems be adjusted or supported or helped? Yeah, for a very well-trained specialist, maybe even using Jane Eyre's sensory integration. We don't have that many people in our state super trained in that to do that within our educational system. And so if you have somebody like that and we're moving for it, fine. But I'm going to tell you, most of us aren't trained in that. And therefore, we're not going to make a dent on the actual system intake itself. Okay. Where we're going to make impact is in that regulatory piece that Karin just mentioned, that fight, flight, or freeze, the way our body takes in that information and does something with it. It's the action that happens as a result of the input that we get. We can definitely mitigate different inputs. That's something we can affect. We can affect environment, things like that. But the child's actual system, not so much. And we shouldn't put our focus on that. Our focus really should be on what is that behavior output telling us that is going on with that child, and how do we help them navigate the body and the world in which they are interpreting, if that makes sense. So that's why I really want to get some of our language normed around sensory. That's why we call it understanding sensory, because we say sensory for everything. Oh, look, he's covering his ears. It must be a sensory issue, right? So I did it all the time. Like I throw it out for everything. Or let's make a sensory room, right? Okay, we use it and we abuse it, and then it loses the true meaning of what it needs, and then we actually kind of steer ourselves away from what we really need to be doing, which is looking at the regulatory system and how that child is using that information and moving forward, and how they are adapting and functioning within it. So,
and actually, I have a really good example of that, because a few years ago, I was doing an evaluation for a young child in a daycare who was transitioning from birth to 3, potentially to school services. Little guy with a diagnosis that would be consistent with an intellectual disability. And he hopped off his chair and saw some Cheerios on the floor, and he stooped down, popped a couple Cheerios in his mouth, and walked off. And his daycare provider turned to me and she goes, "See, he's so sensory seeking." And I looked at her and I was like, or contextually, he just stopped having breakfast, saw something on the floor, picked it up and ate it, because, why not?
They're Cheerios.
They're Cheerios.
Eat them. Yeah.
It was like, and trying to coach her through that moment of not seeing it as a sensory issue, that wasn't going to be meaningful for us, because she and I didn't have a relationship. She didn't trust me. And someone down the line had convinced her that a child picking something up off the floor and putting it in their mouth was always going to be a sensory seeking experience. But the truth is, contextually, I would not say that's what was happening.
Yeah, he's just hungry.
I think so.
Yeah, Cheerios are the best.
Cheerios are yummy.
Right? I used to take them down when there was tornadoes.
Oh my gosh.
To save our lives, I always grab the Cheerios.
There we go.
So when we're talking about regulation, okay, and then that's really where the rest of this is going to go, because that's where we can live inside the educational system. We're thinking about the ability to self-monitor, activate a coping strategy in response to environment, and reflect or advocate for one's needs. Okay. So when I think about this umbrella, like a lot of people like self-regulation, co-regulate, that's all under this. It's just how our body is taking in the information and acting on it, engaging, processing, and moving forward. And so you'll see sensory processing under this umbrella, because you have to get the information in to do something with it. So it's in there, but it's not the driving force of what we can do and what we can support moving forward. And it's got 2 different pieces to it. We've got the cognitive piece, right? That's going to be the knowledge and awareness and the problem solving, right? The executive functioning, the moving around, the actually being able to mitigate some of the stuff. And then there's the behavioral, that context piece, how we fit into things and react off environment, off of other people, off of the situation, right? So you've got your social skills, your behavioral expectations, your motivation, and your impulse control. Like all those things come together to create the actions and the responses that we have in
the moment. And I think it's really key to keep in mind that these higher level cognitive skills, in order for them to really be able to kick in, they have to be well versed, well practiced, and really understood to be natural reactions. They can't just be the things that we've reviewed once and said, okay, so now you guys have these things in the toolkit, go for it. Because when we're just reflexively reacting, we have to have tools that are already naturally accessible for us without having to think about it. And that means they have to be practiced when we're well regulated and able to learn, so that when we're dysregulated, we're able to be like, I need to take a moment. Let me take a nice deep breath right now. Or, run my finger along that piece of Velcro under my desk, or tap my pencil, or go get a glass of water. No, that's not going to happen. A bubble or drink.
Right. So it's those neurological patterns that we're looking for. And so we have to be very conscious in how we are working the system of a child to be able to get those patterns in, and also whether or not they match the child. And that's why I really like, when I think about regulation, I think about developmentally appropriate, right? I love when I see in IEP where it's like kindergarten, right? Kindergartner will identify and pick a coping strategy to do when stressed. Like, have you met 5-year-olds before? That's not developmentally appropriate. And I'm so sorry if you're like, oh, that's one of my goals. It's okay. You know better now. You do better now. Let's get rid of that one. Actually think of where their systems are at and ask yourself, why am I seeing what's going on? So one of the other things I'd really like you to leave with today is, when you see an output from a kid, so behavior, whatever it is, ask yourself, why? Why do I see this? Hopefully the information we give today will help you have more in your brain to be able to go, it could be this. It could be regulatory, like his body is processing, got this information, and the reaction was, I'm overwhelmed or I'm underwhelmed, right? The kids who are shut down, which we forget a lot, especially in that fight, flight, or freeze. The freezers get ignored because they're not throwing a chair at us, and they are as much in crisis as the child who threw the chair. So we've got to make sure that we're really thinking about, why do we see that kid's head on the table? Why do we see that kid running from the room? Why do we see that kid plugging their ears and screaming at the top of their lungs for 45 minutes, right? So the other piece that I really hope you can walk away with today is asking yourself why, not I need to do this or that quick fix. Like, really take your time and root cause and find out where we're going with what's going on.
Yeah, please, because not every kid who covers their ears needs sound cancellation headphones. I'm just saying.
Although they are lovely. I used to wear them all the time in my classroom.
They come in handy.
So let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's actually I love this part because it's going to get super techy with Karn, but like understanding that difference between information coming in and our body processing it, but then what it does with it, so helps you answer those whys and really give up on some of our quick fixes that really don't process into engagement later.
So first of all, it's really important to understand that these things are unconscious, okay? So when we're talking about modulation, you might also use the term regulation. It's referring to the child's ability to change their response to incoming information from their environment or their self to produce behaviors that are what we consider to be in the expected zone, or maybe the just right regulatory zone. These would be things like, if somebody bumps you in line, you either ignore it or you just kind of turn and smile at the individual and recognize that you're not being attacked, right? Or if your coat falls off the coat hook, you don't melt down into a puddle of tears. You just pick up the coat and you put it back on the hook. It's also something that could be evidence that the child has difficulty taking in various sensations from their environment. So they might be having a hard time taking in all of the noise, all of the activity around them, all of what they have to see and feel. Even if they're not being physically touched, the movement in a busy room affects that proprioceptive sense that you have. And if they're having a hard time with all of that, they're going to have a hard time regulating or modulating their response, okay? Discrimination, however, is referring to the child's ability to accurately perceive a sensation and then use that sensation to be able to produce an adaptive functional behavior. That's super fancy language to be able to say like, oh, I see that the lights are on. It means that I can get up from nap right now. Or, oh, I can tell that I need to move because I just accidentally bumped the wall. And so I need to just shift my weight a little bit to the left so I'm standing up on my own. These are things that give us really important information about where we are in space, about how we're supposed to be participating in class right now, how to raise our foot high enough to be able to walk up and down the stairs in the school, or be able to participate in self-care routines like arrival departure routines and toileting routines, or the dreaded cafeteria. So this slide really talks again about those desired system responses versus those what we consider atypical system responses. And I really want to point out that just because you have a system difference or a sensory difference, it is not automatically sensory dysfunction. Dysfunction is inherently a barrier to your ability to participate. That makes it dysfunctional. Otherwise, it's a difference. And guess what? Differences are awesome. We have amazing differentiated education. I love meeting all kinds of different people. It's key to have differences. We don't all react the same way. And trust me, we don't all want to act and react the same way. So as you can see on the screen, there's a functional window of response that's defined as the desired response system. So within this, and we all fluctuate, as you can see by that red line, within this window every day. So just think in terms of like in the morning when you get up and you get dressed and you get in your car to go to work, you listen to the music and you're great, right? Go through your day, get in the car, turn on the car, and that music is crazy loud. Well, guess what? In the morning, you're a little bit lower in that perfect area of response. And in the afternoon, you're probably a little bit higher. So your systems needed more input in the morning and they don't need that input later on, but you are functional the whole day, right? That atypical response system though, this is where we start to see perhaps some more dysfunction and some lack of ability to engage with what's happening in the moment in a meaningful way. And for our kids who are having issues with regulation or modulation, they're usually functioning in these atypical system response arenas. And that means that they're either elevated, and we see these a lot, we notice them a lot, right? Or they're withdrawn. And these are the kids who often get missed. And those are the kids who break my heart because we are underserving them, in my opinion, on a regular basis. The squeaky wheel, you guys, always gets the attention. And the kid who's just huddled over their desk or under their desk, sometimes we overlook them because they're not causing a problem. But the question is, are they accessing their learning?
We really have to think about that processing piece and how we're able to navigate how our body shows up in the world. And when we have struggles, being able to navigate how our body shows up, then we're looking at an approachable dysfunctional piece to look at. If it's just looking at how we just adjust, we might still support that, but I wouldn't truly call that dysfunction. It's just a sensory difference, and we all have them. I bet I could pick out one from every single one of you if I really needed to. That actually might be kind of fun, but we're not in person, so I can't do that.
I know, that's too bad. I would actually add to that it's important to understand the difference between our own social norms or personal preferences and how they inform our judgments of function versus dysfunction. So as an example, Katie's talking about wearing maybe open-toed sandals or something when it's quite a bit colder, and I would have put my sandals away for a long time. The dysfunction would be if she were a health and safety risk, right? So if we have kids who can't tolerate footwear, but they're at a point of health and safety, like their toes are going to fall off because of frostbite, that is a legitimate concern that needs to be addressed with the family and worked through. How can we better accommodate the students so that they're not at personal risk? If, however, I just personally believe that this child should be wearing a different set of shoes because it doesn't seem to me that it's the right season, that's my norm. And I don't necessarily have the right to place that on that child. We're going to talk about that discrimination or that sensory piece, that what comes in, how we interpret it, and how we respond to it. We all have those sensory systems. We just talked about them a little bit ago, and they react to input largely unconsciously. In some cases, as we mentioned, our students might have a dysfunctional system for processing input. In fact, it's not just our students, our coworkers, our family members, ourselves, it's all over, it's okay. So what that means, of course, is that their body's interpretation of whatever's happening around them is preventing them from functioning, from doing what needs to be done in that moment, or from being able to access a response that makes contextual sense, right? So they might hear the fire alarm and dive under their desk. And you're getting timed and observed by the fire department, and you really need them to leave, right? We've got a problem for a couple of reasons, but their response doesn't really match the need of the situation at the moment. And that's where the breakdown is. It's dysfunctional. I think it's also really key to understand that just because the observed behavior doesn't seem to match the situation, that doesn't mean it's sensory based, right? So I like to say that, you know, all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs, right? Not all dysfunctional responses are sensory based, but it is true that if you have sensory dysfunction, you're likely to have a mismatch in how you respond to situations. I really hope that makes sense.
I like it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, you guys, this is where I start to geek out. I happen to love this pyramid. I use it in a variety of presentations. I really feel like if you've not had a chance to just refresh yourself on this pyramid, if you've seen it before, or if it's the first time you've seen this, really take some time to remind yourself how key this foundation development up to academic learning is to our kids, right? Like academic learning is way up at the top of that pyramid, and at the base are these sensory systems. If we don't have these really solid foundations organized within the brain, then we really can't expect natural functional pathways to be developing for accessing our learning. Without that solid foundation, that interpretation, it just doesn't follow the expected path. And that's where we get those outcomes or those observed behaviors where we're like, oh, I don't know what just happened there. The question then isn't what do we do about it? It's how do we make better sense of it to ensure that we're really drilling down to the actual need. Some people actually live in this stress response system because what they have learned within their brain to be okay and not okay are just very different from what the rest of us have learned. And so they're hypervigilant all the time because their body and brain have learned that they have to be able to protect themselves. How we interpret people's faces, how we experience touch, all of that is processed through this little gem in the brain called the amygdala. And it rules the roost when it comes to how we respond totally unconsciously to what's happening around us. It stores these like neural memories of things that have happened to us in the past that might have happened to us before we even had language, you guys. I mean, we're talking like deep unconscious experiences that can inform how we respond in the future in ways that we just can't possibly explain. It is entirely possible for our neurotypical students to be able to just work through those things and move forward. But for our kids who are functioning with what we might consider to be non-neurotypical, it might be from environmental concerns or genetic concerns. If these sensory experiences aren't getting interpreted properly in creating those expective responses, we would consider an adaptive response. So if I touch your shoulder and you think it's a bug because that just happened to you, you might hit me, right? Or try to flick it off. But if your sensory system says, oh, that's your friend touching your shoulder, you're going to just turn and be like, hey. So the truth is, when we have these kids who live in this hyper-responsive hyperactivity mode, we have to help them understand how to retrain their systems. And the good news, you guys, is that tons of evidence shows that practicing the pause and teaching kids how to take that moment, for instance, through mindfulness or breathing, are incredibly powerful ways to retrain our responses and normalize them, allowing kids to just keep moving forward to accessing their education.
Right, because it's all about that balance. So your brain is constantly trying to keep a balance where your brain is making all the energy it can, like as least amount of energy it can, to keep it to the predictive system that it has going for it. We all have prediction systems from the second we pop out, right? And our experiences build that prediction system. Your brain actually predicts what's going to happen before you actually experience it. And when it mismatches, when the environment doesn't match it, it takes energy to have that adaptive switch or to learn or to do anything other than the path your brain expected. So when you have a whole bunch of experiences that have made pathways and predictions that don't match the context, that's where we run into behavior output, right? So for example, you are in a math class and a child pops up and runs from the room. Most of you are going to say, hey, man, that's not cool. Not supposed to run out of the math room. We're in the middle of math. Okay. Now let's say the math room's on fire. Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Run from the math room. It's on fire, right? So the running from the room isn't the issue, right? We have to ask ourselves, why are we running from the room? I might have been triggered. I hit a frustration level, right? And so it was a cognitive load issue. And so my body went into fight, flight, or freeze, right? With the fire, it's, oh my gosh, I had to actually physically save myself.
Right.
So when we think about the energy it takes to not be in your predictive state, so the kids that are showing up, like Karen was explaining, the hypervigilant kids, a child who has experienced trauma with the person who abuses them is a white upper middle class woman. And I don't know, your school's full of those people. So they come into school and they're going, am I safe? 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 Right? We're 20 minutes into reading and their brain is still going, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Oh, it's the teacher. Got it. Oh, reading's over. Right. And they stayed in this whole mode. Their brain was just trying to make sure that the prediction was right, that, like that, or was giving them the prediction they might not be safe. And so that's what the brain was focusing on. There was no balance there. That takes a lot of energy too. So you've got a lot of kids who, when their pathways are not in alignment with context, and their brain is constantly trying to activate that fight, flight, or freeze, and it might be even low levels, we have to appreciate that actually takes a lot of energy, and that a lot of our kids might have behavior output from exhaustion from just trying to be in an environment. Right. And it's not about the fact that they had to process all the sensory information. It's about their brain making sense of the information to find out whether or not they need to run from the room. Okay. So when we think about balance, it's going to be different for each of our kids, but I really want us to make sure we know that it's happening. And so that it doesn't, especially for our kids who are shutting down that freeze, it's not a lack of motivation. It's not a lack of, we put all these labels to kids. And some kids are just exhausted from being within in a context that they can't predict. And when we think about how much input you get within a school day versus maybe at home or in the community, much different forced input than you do, because parents will, oh, that doesn't happen at home. Well, I wouldn't think so. You don't have the amount of stimulus we have 100%. Here. Yeah.
And I think too, it's really key to understand that parts of the things that can be really effective here are relationship building. And those classroom procedures that create predictability, right? Because predictable is comfortable. And if you have a relationship with someone, then you generally will, if you have a positive relationship with someone, you have a relationship where you feel trust and safe. So spend that extra time with these kiddos that seem to be struggling quite a bit to develop that relationship, and really consider your classroom procedures to create that predictability. It's incredibly powerful, and it'll help everybody in the end. So when we're looking at the evidence to practice, and we're looking at, specifically from an occupational therapy perspective, one of the things that has become the norm, and I understand how we got here, but it's going to take some work because we can't stay here, folks, is we have come into this kind of prescriptive model of expecting certain things to be key successes, or key to the success for students to be able to engage in their learning. But a lot of them remove the kids from their natural environment and actually violate their faith, if we're being honest. So within the educational environment, we really have to focus on engagement, participation, and always that focus on access, true access, right? Not just forced sitting in a room, but actual facilitating the right types of access for a student to be engaging in learning. So there's a really large body of research that's beginning to shift our thinking as occupational therapists of how we use those sensory-based interventions, and also, again, how we use those terms such as sensory integration. I mentioned before, sensory integration, it's actually a trademarked system of intervention, and it does have a very prescriptive protocol that comes out of a deep dive analysis for an individual's particular concerns. So that's not really what we do in the schools, right? I mean, not that many of us are actually certified in air sensory integration. And certainly once the individual, if you happen to be lucky enough to have someone like that, leaves the building, the rest of the people aren't able to carry over or replicate those systems and those strategies for the kids. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to be discussing why the research is leading us to shift away from the term sensory diet. And I know you guys hold on to your seats, the use of sensory rooms. In fact, I had been advocating for a really long time that we don't even call them sensory rooms or sensory spaces. We should call them what it is we want to happen in them, and that's self-regulation. Should not be in a separate room, you guys, unless it absolutely is necessary for that individual child to be able to leave their learning environment to regulate. We need to be growing their capacity to regulate in their learning space. So ideally, self-regulation strategies are happening in the classroom where the child is, right?
Or the natural environment.
The natural environment,
Because when we think about from 3-year-olds to 21, a natural environment might be a work site, or it might be a daycare. So we want to make sure that I don't think either of us will say that a separate room isn't useful in some way, shape, or form.
100%.
But research really shows when you can do it in a natural environment, that is the best mode, whether it's learning math, whether it is learning how to socially interact, or whether it is learning to regulate. The real world is a natural environment.
Right.
A separate room down the hall that takes 10 minutes to get a kid in crisis to isn't a regulation room. Ask your students what they call that room. Either the ones that can verbally answer you when you go to that room. What is this room? Right? What is that to you?
It's the playroom.
Yeah, it's the playroom, or it's the place I go when I'm naughty. Right?
Ooh.
So you'll get a lot of seclusion or restraint language coming out of children. On our wonderfully stocked, beautiful rooms that have murals. I have seen some rooms that I was like, well, yeah, this is a really calm place that I have never seen really calm kids come in calm, going, oh, it's so calm in here now, right? Because they're always in crisis in those rooms. I love when an OT uses what people are calling their sensory rooms as just their work area, or you bring other kids in and you're doing a social piece. Yep. So that room isn't about when I'm in crisis. The room is actually being about calm, right? And that takes practice of using it in other times and not moving a child into crisis into it. But ask your students what they think the calm down room really is. Have them describe it and why we use it and see what they say. And it might open your eyes a little bit to the fact that we shouldn't be using sensory rooms, that our natural environment is the best place. I'm not saying it's the end all be all. There's definitely a continuum, but we need to think about moving away from that prescriptive kind of idea that we go there every 20 minutes and it's going to fix something, to what are we using it for and how do we use it and how are we practicing when not in crisis.
And no matter what, you guys, the decisions that an IEP team makes have to be data driven. So if we haven't collected the data to support that certain things need to be in place, they shouldn't be in the IEP right now. And that's really key. One of the things that happens when I'm on initial evaluation teams is we'll talk about, the supplementary aids and services. And should we be adding in sensory breaks or any other specific type of self-regulation tool to be able to make sure that we've created the kind of document that really represents what the student needs. And very rarely do I have the data to support putting that in supplementary aid and service at an initial IEP. What I do is I put a statement in the present level that indicates that these needs are going to be, really analyzed over the course of the next year, and certain strategies should be trialed, and that, in the future, and that's all I put. But the staff understand then that in the future, if there are specific things, then we put them in the supplementary aids and services, but only after we have true data to support that they need to be present. It just makes no sense to have a whole host of supplementary aids and services and then a child who's not actually utilizing them to regulate in any way, shape, or form.
Because you're still legally forced to provide them.
Absolutely.
Even if it doesn't match kid.
If you've got something in there and it is not present for that child, you are not following the legal aspect of that IEP. The other thing I want to make sure that we talk about here is that prescriptive piece. They were strategies that were developed at a time when we used a deficit model that was really focused on repair. And Katie touched on this a little bit earlier. particularly in education, we aren't necessarily going to be able to set aside the time to try to repair that neurological disconnect that is happening for the student. But we might be able to use external supports or scaffolds to be able to help them access their education and truly engage in whatever that's happening around them at the moment. So some of what we're saying today might lead you to ask, well, what can I do to help kids with sensory differences? And you might even be thinking, well, I've seen some of these things work. Guess what? So have we, 100%. And when we have the data to support some of these sensory strategies, then we use them, right? But they should try to be folded into that most naturalized environment so that the child is learning how to participate in their day-to-day life activities and not learning that in order to be able to do something, they have to leave. Here's the thing about our research. These days, it is telling us that these super popular things that we have used for decades in schools, and frankly, were happening before I ever started, and I've been doing this a long time, they're not supported. So these are single system interventions. A swing is generally only really focusing on vestibular unless you've added in another activity. That weighted bear or the weighted turtle or the weighted blanket, you know, all of the things that are pictured up here, the weighted vest, oh, you guys haven't been a favorite of mine for a very long time. These are things that we don't have good evidence in affecting the change that we think that it affects for our students. The outcomes aren't there. And so the evidence suggests we should not be using them. At the highest level of evidence, which is like systemic literature reviews, research that meets the standards of replicable design, high numbers of participants, control groups, the use of really sound data analysis, it all says this stuff is just not working for our kids. So when we know better, we do better, right? I've used all of these at some point in my career, you guys, and occasionally I've even collected data that indicates that for one particular student, it's working at certain times. And so those are tools we built in to use. And if that was still the data I was collecting, I might then choose to use them at certain times in very prescribed ways because we had the data to support it. But these are not things that we should just be willy-nilly suggesting that every kid needs to have.
Yeah. So this really makes me think about that whole idea that we're not really going to be able to fix a child's system, where I think a lot of times we go to these things to try to fix a child's system. Now, we might have a preference. Like I could have a kid that super loves having that weighted turtle on his lap. And so that's not going to fix their system,
right?
But it might make them engage because they got something they like on their lap, right? I have a weighted blanket, so I like it. But is it fixing my system? No, it's not fixing my system. It's just a sensory preference. And so there's a difference between I am going to put this into an IEP because I think it's actually affecting a child's system, to be like they picked the cool color that they liked. And so they went with that color more often. Is that a good way to describe it? So, I mean, the weighted vest, the weighted stuff, I try to stay away from because there's strict protocols on actual muscular change you can do and damage you can do with weighted stuff. So if you are in any way, shape, or form using something weighted, you should be consulting with an OT and hoping that the OT has an understanding of weighted protocol, because that's very important. If you're thinking about seclusion and restraint law, anything you put on a child, that child should be able to take off themselves immediately if they don't like it. And so if you are wrapping a child in a weighted blanket, their arms cannot be in it. They have to be able to take it off. And if they take it off immediately, you leave it off. You don't go, no, you're really going to like this. Let's just wrap you up again. So when we think about the things that we use that are single system interventions, there are protocols that go with almost all of them, right? Like the brushing, if you think of it, there's an actual method to the brushing, and pieces like that, like weighted vests or swings. You can really throw somebody's system off by swinging them. So when we think about those, you should have somebody who is an expert at it, and you might not have your OT be an expert in those things, and therefore you shouldn't be using them at all. But when I look at these things now, because I use them all, I wholeheartedly thought, and you can see it, you're like, the kid changes completely, right? It's not about fixing their system. And that's what we think we were doing. It is about supporting their engagement. And so you might have uses of those things in different ways. The weighted stuff, I passed the turtle. is pretty much what I would do. And like, I would have weighted turtles still in my classroom because weighted turtles are cool, but they're not fixing a system and they're not making any kids sit in a place forever and ever, right? They're not doing what we thought they did. And so when we move away from these things, we need to look at a difference between whether or not we have evidence that it is an actual preference of a child, right? And or whether or not it is just something we applied because the child can't walk through a hall, so we put a weighted vest on them.
You know, I'm looking at this slide and I'm recognizing that from an occupational therapy perspective, we can appreciate how each of the different sensory systems might be impacted with these, and also how you might accidentally have a collision of different types of sensory interactions if you used more than one of these things at the same time.
Yeah.
But if you're not trained the way I'm trained or other occupational therapists might be trained, and frankly, you guys, not all of us have the same training in this, then you don't understand what kind of impact you might be having. And it can be a neurological impact, not just a social impact. And I would just say, if you're starting to consider the use of these things and the occupational therapist isn't involved in the conversation, you need to stop and get the OT involved. It's really key. Just the other day, with the best of intentions, I saw on some kind of chat within our district that a teacher was struggling and another teacher offered her a variety of solutions, all of which take specialty training for occupational therapists, and none of which I suspect this particular teacher had any kind of training in, other than possibly a training in passing from another OT. Really well-intended recommendations, but without understanding what you're doing with those things, you could really be causing more of a problem. And we don't want to do that, right?
No, so a prime example, I had a student that loved the swing, would totally engage well on the swing, because I had a swing installed in my classroom, right? When I said I did these things, I did them all, right? I would lose his ability to learn the rest of the day, right? So I would get the engagement on that swing because he was an under arousal kid, and then it was done. And I got nothing. And sometimes we actually got more behavior. I threw his system off because I was not understanding how that works. I just did it willy-nilly on my own. And I actually know a lot of stuff, but I'm not fully trained in protocols around these items and how that single system intervention can affect, like Karin was saying, like other pieces, like all the other things that might be layered in there that I had no idea that I was affecting as well. So I know better, I do better. I would definitely not put a swing in, like, well, maybe, like for myself.
I mean, they're
swing
fun.
games. Yeah, they are fun,
but
I wouldn't use it the way I thought I was using it.
And I think that's another piece, you guys. We're assuming on this slide that everything has a sensory basis for a student's preference, but sometimes it is just play, right? I mean, at its core, like when we're talking about sensory integrative therapy, we're talking about child-led play where they're exploring a variety of different things. Well, guess what? That's what happens when you go out on the playground, right? I've often explained to parents, like, you don't have to go to an expensive private clinic. You can just go to the playground. And I really would encourage you to start doing these kinds of things to help support your child access the swing or the slide. But the truth is, childhood is about seeking out fun opportunities. And for some of our kids, it's not that they're getting a sensory experience that they neurologically need. It's that they're getting a sensory experience that they're having fun with.
Yes.
And that is not motivating to go back to reading.
No.
I'm just saying.
Very true. So that gets to the point that sensory rooms are on the prescriptive side of things.
Yeah, they are.
Not on the true access, engagement, and progress piece.
Yeah. And you guys, we touched on this a little bit already, but you have to consider the legal and safety measures that come into play when we're talking about a separate space with a lot of equipment. And again, if we're looking at that slide, that is an occupational therapy gym, if not also physical therapy gym, right there on the slide. And if that is your calming room, then you have a host of things that have to be really specifically trained, and you got to be careful because there's a lot of things that could happen there that have unintended consequences for the health and safety of our students. So really, when it comes down to it, on the whole, again, we don't want different rooms for our kids to be going to calm down in. If individual students have very specific needs, of course, we're going to have those conversations and we're going to try to give them those opportunities while also building their capacity to stay in the space they're supposed to be. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, they need that break. It's also, how do we then also grow their ability to not need that break. And I would just say also, sometimes that break isn't for the student, right? I mean, some of our kids are pretty challenging, and our teachers 100% are challenged with differentiated education. The onus on our teachers these days is extraordinary. And sometimes we need that student to leave the room. That is not what the student needs. And we have to be child-centered, you guys. It has to be a child-centered decision, right? So these rooms are really often handicaps to the kids because they are playgrounds. They are fun. They're an escape from things that are difficult. There's a whole host of reasons that kids come to these. And as Katie mentioned, some of them are going to have negative connotations because they think they're only coming here because they're naughty or something negative has happened. But regardless of what is happening for these kids to end up in these spaces, the focus has to be on keeping them from needing those things. And that is building capacity to regulate within the space where they are supposed to be during their school day. Make sense?
All right, another one that I get a very big soapbox about is sensory breaks. So like Karen was saying, we are all overwhelmed, right? As a teacher, that it is amazing how many things we have to keep in our conscious thought to be able to navigate the students we have in front of us, especially if we're looking at not a zoned down, but a full classroom of like 30 to 40 kids or 20 kids, right? So when I think about sensory breaks, they're still on the prescriptive side of things, right? So we're trying to move away from this prescriptive side of things. I want us to start diving and asking ourselves why we are doing them, right? And when we think about the outcomes of something like a sensory break, it has to have purpose, not just that the child gets to jump away for 20 minutes, right? So do they actually have the skills to calm? So if I'm taking a sensory break, we have students that don't have the skills to actually regulate, have to have co-regulation. And therefore, is that break taking that into effect? Are they with somebody that they can co-regulate with and has a process to help bring them down? Or do we just remove them from the situation, right? What are the unintended consequences of bringing a child out of their natural environment, right? I've had tons of experience with tantruming kids where you're not going to have the student, because not only are they socially failing during a 45-minute screaming tantrum, right? The trigger is probably in the room with them. So we do want to mitigate those pieces. So when I think about those, it was on not a sensory break prescriptive, I do it every 20 minutes, that I had evidence that the body only took 10 minutes of processing and then was done, right? But we do that. Well, every 20 minutes or every at the end of every hour, we go take a break. We do these arbitrary numbers. And then we don't even check to see if the kid re-engages when they come back. But the unintended consequence of removing that child on that time basis is loss of content. They are now marginalized because now they're the kid that gets taken out, right? So they look different. They lose all that social emotional learning, and they lose the context of the learning. When we are piecemealing these poor kids in and out of natural environments, they're getting snippets instead of a whole. And we think those snippets are better for them somehow. And research shows they're not. Right? How many people have you gotten out of special education? Few and far between, but that's our goal as special educators, whatever role you have within that system, is to have them not need us anymore. We are there to help them access, engage, and progress. And once we get those barriers taken down in whichever way, whether it's a quick fix or it's a long-term specially designed instruction that helps them bridge a gap, we're supposed to be working ourselves out of a job, not making them need us more. Sensory breaks makes us need us more without any evidence that it actually does anything for them. Okay, we give these really big unintended consequences when we arbitrarily put in sensory breaks because we think a child just can't handle the amount of time, right? Are we thinking about the system and is it in distress or not, right? Are we actually seeing a child who is having a regulatory issue, or are we just taking those breaks on cue? Okay, so is it triggered or is it timed? When we think about the skill sets it takes to actually self-regulate, it is amazing how many skills are prerequisites to even be able to identify the fact that we need to regulate. Okay, so everybody jumps into some of the big ones you can buy, visual management systems, which are great, like zones and 5-point scale, and like the cat kit or Emily Rubin's emotion kit. They're all great things, but there are so many skill sets that are before that you need to have to be able to actually engage in the work to actually regulate. So when we think about sensory breaks and what they truly are, right, they're usually breaks for us. And we don't have the evidence that shows that a child can re-engage. We make lots of assumptions. We don't actually check to see if we're adding an advocacy system so that they can do it themselves, right? Or we don't even have an idea of where their prerequisite skills are to regulate on their own. And so it's co-regulation. And then we sometimes don't even do a good job during these sensory breaks to actually co-regulate a child if we had a system that we actually knew that like 45 minutes in, they were going to lose it. Okay. So if you're using sensory breaks, I want you to know it needs to be completely data-based. You need to know if that child actually re-engages in work, and you need to figure out the amount of time in the smallest amount that break can take to re-engage the child. If you're not taking, it takes extensive data to understand and make the decision so that you can pass by some of the unintended consequences to have it. Because sometimes we make decisions, say, you know what, that is going to be a consequence. They're going to lose social time. They're going to have but it's more important that we have a child whose brain is at a regulated state to be able to learn the whole day than it is in the social marginalization of being taken from the room. Okay, we make those decisions based on data, not based on the child flips out every day, so we better put these breaks in so he can tolerate the day, with no evidence of that actually being something that would help a child out. So when we think about educational outcomes, right, we really need to think about what we can impact. So now that I hope we drilled it in that we're not going to truly, in an educational setting, unless you're a very trained OT, be able to affect a student's individual system and how it comes in, right? We're going to focus on how do we actually engage? How do we actually get some outcomes? How do we get adaptive actions to happen? How do we get that brain to go off of their predicted path that might not match the situation to come into context so that they have a better flow and they can be the best than they can be within their situation and choose their path, right? So this is where we need to really think about what are those outcomes we want to affect? What is the support system that we want to put in place to be able to make that child the best than they can be on the path they want to be on? And if they don't have a communication system that's strong enough to tell you, then their family is where we're going with that. It's not about how we want them to fit into our situation. Now, do we want them to learn how school works, how to work with groups, right? Those are all social emotional skills that we teach. But when it comes down to it, this child has a path that leaves us at 18 to 21. And therefore, we need to make sure that it's on a path for them, not a path for us. And so it's really hard to take that logistical piece off and start thinking about how do we make the educational participation outcome match that child's path. Or if the child doesn't have that strong enough communication system, or it's not developmentally appropriate. I'm not asking a 3-year-old, like, where do you want to be when you're 21, right? I'm looking at family. Where are you looking? What does this look like? But you're having those conversations because it's a collective responsibility. And if you're not participating in those pieces, then we're not truly showing up for kid at all. And I understand that we do not have access to families sometimes, but that doesn't mean we don't try. We do the best we can within the system we have, right? Because a lot of times you come to these trainings and it's like, great, that's all fabulous best practice, Katie. Like, I'm so glad in a perfect world that worked for you, right? No, we aim high, we start where you are, and we say, what's the next step up, right? So my next step is maybe I just ask the kid, hey, you know what? We do this sensory break thing. Do you like it? No, man, I hate leaving the classroom. All right, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. What would you like to do instead? I'd like to play video games all day. Not an option at school. What's a different one we can talk about, right? We navigate those conversations, even if they come up with extraordinary things. I want to have McDonald's every day. Cool, that sounds like a really good outcome that I cannot provide in the educational system. So let's think school-based. What can we do school-based here? Mention that McDonald's things to mom. I don't know what you can get at home, but we can't do that school-based, right? So when we think about where we go, because we're going to start talking about strategies now, things that we want to, I want you to know to say, we're going best practice here. You got to think about what is your next step towards that. Okay. So if you're like, Katie, everything you've and Karen have said, it sounds great, but I just can't access it. What's the first thing you can?
Right.
Because the next step forward is one more step forward for that kid and their outcomes and how they're going to be the best them they're going to be. Okay. And so when I think about that, I like to start big. Like, what can I do? Because I can't change kid, but I can change what I do. I'm going to start with the high leverage practices. And if you haven't heard of high leverage practices, the CEC. So if you put high leverage practice CEC, you'll get a lot of really good stuff.
Hey, Katie.
Yeah.
Tell me what the CEC is.
That's the Council for. Way to call me out and not have my acronyms. You know what? Look it up. No. So it is a national, a nationally funded federal program that has a lot of really good information. And
I think, Katie, it might be the Council for Exceptional Children.
Yeah, that would be it. It's funny because I'm on a board for that and I can pull it out. So way to go, Karn. See, she triggered my regulatory system to get me to like a 3 and I couldn't access words. So, but when we think about the high leverage practices that kind of match and come here, you can go and you check them all out. There's 22 for special education. There's a whole set in early childhood that's just great information, but you're going to read it, especially if you're a veteran teacher, and go, yeah, that's common sense.
Right.
But when you go past some of them, you go, wait a second, what does that actually look like in my practice? Okay. And that's what I want to kind of bring us to with the high leverage practices. We do a lot of them just naturally. Natural born teachers like live and exude some of these things. Some of them are lenses, some of them are actual strategies. So when we think about some of the ones that I thought kind of match what we're doing here, right? It's taking a child's interest
100%.
and engaging them in a meaningful task within their world, right? Natural environment, where they're at, we start with them and go from there. That seems like pretty common sense to me, but think about how many curriculums we force kids into and how many learning modes we force kids into that they don't fit. So we have huge behavior outcomes and we're like, they're just naughty. No, we didn't match that kid. And what's really difficult is the kind of kids we have are a very big, diverse group now. And so trying to teach to a norm just isn't something we can do anymore because it's not producing the people we need to have be community, college, or career ready. In the end, right? School has changed. So when we think about what other high levels practice, actually making things meaningful to real life experiences.
Absolutely.
Right?
Everyday activities.
Mm-hmm.
If our kids are engaged in things that are clearly meaningful to how they participate in everyday life, those are going to wire in the brain much faster, much more successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to create opportunities because the opportunities are existing right there within the day. Perfect.
Right. So this kind of gives, I have a whole spiel on fidgets, and the best fidget is the one that's most natural, right?
Absolutely.
Like I love the big fancy things you can buy. I have a lot of them, but the best thing is something natural. So when we think about natural environments, the most research placed for you to learn is a natural environment, not a separate environment. When we think about how fidgets work, the best ones are the natural ones. When we do real life activities and natural environments, we are on a path. So we're always looking, how can we get to that step closer to providing that, right? So we think, well, obviously, Katie, that's common sense, but what's it look like in our practice? What's my next step to actually live that practice? Okay. Intense repetition and frequency, right? To activate that. When you have all the different layers in your brain and an experience gets tracked in multiple different ways, you have access to it in multiple different ways. That's called generalization, right? Or what's the problem is when we have an experience that happens in the same way in the same person, and that gets to a problem, we can't move it somewhere else. So when we have intense repetition and frequency to activate that, you have more neurological patterns to be able to pull up from and different combinations, which is even better.
And so it's rigidity versus flexibility, right? Being able to more consistently use what you need and be able to access what you need to access to engage in your real world activities.
And then scaffolding, right? Actually showing up where a kid is and taking that next step of that zone of proximal. Wow, so you threw me off and now I'm losing all my words. And you all know what I'm talking about. That zone of learn it, but you have to know what that zone is to be able to do that. So that just right challenge, that perfect piece, and that's all about knowing kid. And so when we think about the scaffolds we do put in place, right? How does this live in my practice? How far do we go? Are we actually thinking about, does the child interpret their internal signals,
those
messages,
interoceptive messages,
to be able to say, I feel anxious, I feel right? Do they have all of those pieces? If not, then we're not doing just right challenge if you're saying they have to trigger a coping system, because they don't even know they need to trigger it, right? And they can't put that into their conscious brain, whether it's an impulse issue or whether it is actually I don't even notice the things that are going on within my body. So when we think about these things, it's got to be making sure that we are actually putting into practice. If you need different buckets or different language around it, mindfulness is a great one. Cognitive picture rehearsal, right? Actually training your brain to be able to do what you want it to do. Thinking about the motor play strategies, the things that we just go through and experience on a regular basis to be able to help a child's brain integrate more, and being purposeful with it and thinking about what's the actual functional outcome of doing this, right? We can play all day. And when we think about play, we often only think about up to like kindergarten. And then after that, play goes away. And we really need to have play go all the way to adulthood. If you are sitting in this training right now, we are not playing much. And I bet you anything, you've almost tuned us out. I actually recommend you pause and maybe come back later, because this is a long one. I should have said that, like, I don't know, an hour ago. We need to play all the time. The pieces that, we don't call it play as an adult, but it's play. The things that engage humor, movement, all those things in your brain, when they are patterning in your experiences to make meaning out of them, they're going through so many different layers. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that the more layers you get an experience in on, the more likely you'll be able to pull in different situations from things layered in. If you have one mode that you're doing everything in, that doesn't work. So you need to play throughout life to actually grow your brain. Absolutely. And so it's, like kindergarten, yes, we need to put that back in intense ways and in layered ways, and understanding that within that play, there is so much we are learning, not just social emotionally, but academically, if play is done right. But that shouldn't end once we get to like first, second grade, third grade. One of the big things I said I wanted you to walk away with today is asking yourself why when you see a behavior output. So something happens, it doesn't match context. Let's start asking ourselves why. So let's look at this example. So when I asked a student, how does she feel? She always says, good, right? I encourage you, if you haven't done the root cause analysis process, to check out the video we have on it on the SNS website, but also to check out the DPI resources on root cause analysis within the CCRIP resources they have. But it's really getting together with somebody else and brainstorming through what we see and not staying at surface level explanations. So if I say, okay, so I have a student, and every time I ask her how she's doing, she says good. So then you would ask me, why do you think that is?
Why do you think that is?
Well, I've really noticed that her nonverbal communication skills don't really match her words often. So I'm thinking there is a disconnect of how I'm interpreting what's going on with her, and what is actually physically going on with her.
And so then what does that look like?
So, she has like really limited descriptive words, and emotions and feelings. Like, I'm really wondering, there's got to be a piece with that.
Do you think that she's able to identify what's happening around her body?
You know what? I don't know if she's ever in my presence correctly identified an emotion when she, like sometimes she's in crisis, but not all the time. And so I'm really wondering if she really does have those body signal pieces that she's missing, that her body is telling her things and she is not picking up on the signals and making meaning out of them. Right. So that would be an example of a root cause discussion that would get to that. This particular student, and this is one technical word that I love, has alexithymia, which is she's got body signals that she is not making meaning of to be able to put emotional words to it, to be able to navigate and adapt to it. And she has the other layer of her nonverbals are not communicating to others in the expected pattern that we would be able to react off of. So she's missing all of that practice in the back and forth of the emotional exchange of information as well. So when we think about alexithymia, which is emotional intelligence, we're thinking about the difficulty in identifying the feeling, right? That signal coming from your body. An example, and I didn't figure this out way later in my adulthood, that when I have really extreme anxiety, it feels like somebody is grabbing my spine and squeezing it, which I found out is muscle spasm. I get muscle spasms when I get so worked up with my anxiety. So that is, I identified a signal within my body. I could relate it to an emotion word, a feeling, so that I could move on to be able to do something about it. So when we're thinking about somebody who has a low emotional intelligence or is emerging in their ability to identify, they're looking at those signals and pairing it to language and or in language, I mean not just verbal language, but also that nonverbal, like we were talking about, that student nonverbals didn't match what we would expect. So language is not just verbs. Taking the signal, being able to put language to it, distinguishing between different feelings, right? But also being able to advocate and have that communicated to another. That is some of the prerequisite skills that we see some of our students who struggle with regulation that they don't have, but we miss, and we go right into coping. Well, you're never going to be able to trigger a coping mechanism if your impulse system never lets you have the time to. You can't get it into conscious self. That's what we're talking about with that amygdala earlier, when you're hijacked, when it's fight, flight, or freeze, and your brain's already taking you down a path of safety and avoidance or to get, right? Those big trigger pieces. But in the lower stages, you're not going to be able to interrupt it if your impulse system's too strong, if it's hypervigilant. But for students who can get that breath, can stop,
Practice the pause.
right? And can get a cognitive thought in, they have to have the ability to understand what's going on with their body to be able to advocate and move forward in whichever way that looks.
And just tying that all together, we're talking about that interoceptive connection. And Katie's going to talk a little bit more about this particular curriculum because it's amazing.
Yeah, so when we think about interoception, there's actually a lot of stuff out there. Kelly Mahler is one of the biggest voices, and she gives me permission to talk about this stuff. So that's why she shows up here. She's not the only one, but she does have free resources. But what's really nice about her, the information she brings, she makes it really simple. It's about teaching kids body sensations, putting language to it, and then putting an action, matching an action to it. And that might not be something they can do in time for a while. And developmentally, we think about that. It's not like a kindergartner is going to go, I feel this, so I do, right? We think so much cognitive thought is going in processing, going with kindergartners because they have language that masks the fact that they're just going off of models. They're just repeating things they've seen. You know, like you don't get real good metacognitive thought if your brain is progressing on the skill sets that we expect till about third grade. About third grade is when you're really getting to be able to have that metacognitive thought. But we can practice this. We can use the language. We can teach kids to push against a wall and then feel how your hands feel how your arms feel, run in place, and then feel how your heart's beating. Those are the type of things we can start modeling and showing and starting to put words to, so that when we get to a developmental point in which they can have the conversation of, what do you think can calm your heart back down, right? Well, you know, deep breathing, right? Or things like that. And we start practicing different stuff that matches kid. Because that's the other thing we forget to do is match kid. Not all the strategies that we use match each kid. So we never force kids into a coping mechanism. We invite them. Breathing is a perfect example. Very researched. When you take deep breaths, your body reacts. Hands down, it doesn't matter. It's going to react. But when you've got a kid who has extreme asthma, talking and engaging in breathing actually might be anxiety producing. So we never force, we always invite. Like let's say you're having a fight with your partner and they say, take a breath. How many people take a breath? How many people get really angry and go, did you just tell me to take a, right? And you're barely breathing because you are now yelling at them about telling you to take a breath. So when we talk about coping systems and having kids pick the ones we've taught them, we need to be picking ones that match them and finding out where their system goes. And so that goes back to that why again. Why are they running from the room? Like, okay, well, you know what I learned also having that why conversation? That running from the room is a coping mechanism that body uses. Does it match context right now? No, we were in the middle of math, right? So we've got to find one that might be more adaptive and more context matching, right? And help merge it into that. But we're going to use what that body is already seeking and already doing, and appreciating that a child's opinion and a child's wants and needs are very important in matching a coping system, and that not even the big ones like breathing match everybody. But when we look at how you break it down to teach, right, that interoception awareness, that alexithymia, right, we teach, invoke a sensation from in their body, connect it and give it meaning to a word or a phrase or a system of language, and then match a regulatory piece to it, a coping mechanism. And that's all student driven, okay? And we have to understand that your impulse control plays a huge role in this, and that sometimes children cannot interrupt the system to be able to engage in a coping mechanism. And it might take a little bit of the crisis to happen before their body starts to get to a point where they can. So it's not like it happens 100% of the time. Because if we're not really thinking about how children match their bodies and how it works, and the practice done when not in crisis, when we're just hanging out, that's why I love when our natural environment teachers are just doing regulatory things constantly within the classroom, just modeling them, right? Like, oh, we just came from recess. Let's everybody do the, square breathing, or let's try square breathing if you want.
Or let's all stretch.
Yep. Oh, when you see yoga, and you don't have to call it yoga, if you stretch, you do, any of those physical pieces that are going to invoke a regulatory system to calm down, right? Modeling it, making it part of your system, making it just what you do versus, oh, you look really upset right now let's engage this. The practice is important, and it's really good to make sure that, especially if you're a natural environment or a general ed teacher, figure out some of the big kids that need regulatory issues and then follow the ones that match their body first and go with that within your system of modeling. Okay, so when we think about things that match kid, we need to think about your environment, your activities, and the strategies used. Those are the things you can go into to be able to help a child get these experiences, practice these experiences. So when they are triggered, we have a possibility of it actually happening naturally. Because most kids, I love when people are like, well, she threw that chair on purpose. Like, I'm pretty sure that second grader didn't go, wow, that math problem you just gave me really pissed me off. So I'm going to pick up this chair and I think today I'm going to throw it at Johnny. Yep, here we go. Chair goes to Johnny today. Right? We use language like these kids are making all these choices, and it is just a body flow of a neurological pattern. So when you think about how you can ingrain practices in your environment, your activities, and your strategies that help practice regulatory things like the deep breathing or the movement, the stretching, the cognitive picture rehearsal, all the mindfulness, those type of things in your practice, it's more likely that they might have that path that they go down instead of the chair. If we're not practicing those all the time, the chair is going to happen, right? And I'm not saying that doing mindfulness is going to cut out all throwing of chairs. I'm saying you are more likely to have a student have a different neurological path that their brain triggers into when you have a system of practice that is not just when they get pulled out with their OT and do a coping strategy for 10 minutes once a week.
No, universal practices are far more powerful than anything else we can individually teach a student who has unique needs. Mm-hmm. Universal is exactly where we should all be living and putting our energy.
Right. But we think through the one. So I love thinking about the kid who's the total outlier, right? And I figure out things that are going to work for him, and I do it for everybody else. Right. So I go from the one, the kid with the IEP, that's probably the biggest outlier I got, my chair thrower. I shouldn't have said that way. A person who throws chairs to release energy, right? Because things that are going to work for them are going to work for other kids in your room. And they're not going to work for everybody because everybody's individual. But if I can get that into my system, that will help a lot more than trying to retrofit him back into a system that wasn't built for him.
Or to retrofit a system, to put a system that is unique to him specifically in a classroom that just causes more social alienation.
Yep. And marginalization.
And more marginalization.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It just becomes the norm, right? So when you use zones with one kid versus just using zones with everyone, right? That would be a good example of that. We also need to be thinking about how we are teaching children to advocate for themselves. We need to work ourselves out of a job. If a child doesn't understand, let's say, I've got a picture of fidgets up here. If they don't know why they need the fidget, then great. The fidget helped you keep them, regulated or keep attention, which fidgets don't usually keep kids with ADHD whose brains don't know what to pay attention to, paying attention to you because you give them a fidget. Yeah, you just gave them something else to not pay attention to. So if you don't know what fidgets are really for, stop using them. They're fun toys. If you want them as engagement tools, you need to know what you're doing for the child. And that child needs to know what that thing is doing for them. So when they go into the community, go into a career, or go to college, they can walk up and say, can I please have this? Because that helps me get to this, right? Can I please have a standing desk? Because I can be more productive standing than I can sitting, right? So if we're leaving out the avocation piece, if the kids don't know why they have what they have, we're missing a big chunk. Now, is every student at an independent level that they're at the advocacy level? No. But we take the next step towards it, right? We get to know what works for them best. We get to know and put it into their system. We involve them in their IEP. We always make sure we're taking one next step to reach that advocacy piece so that they can be as self-determined, have self-advocacy, and when they leave us at 18 to 21, they are not falling off a cliff or completely dependent on adults. Always looking to what is that next step. And when we think about some of the sensory fixes that we go to, like fidgets, it is imperative that they know why they're using them. On the website, the SNSWI.com, so SNSWI.com, under Understanding Sensory, this training, there is a video that is a really cool one to be able to show either other adults or kids themselves about what fidgets are all about and how we need to use them. It's a good one. So when we think about some of the strategies that we might be using, these are all great research strategies. So from now on, like other people come to these kind of sessions and like, what do I do? I need something to do. Here's the what you do. Okay. So the first one is a big one and it's not going to shock you, but it's breathing. But there's a lot of different ways we can invite kids to breathe that can make it fun and exciting. The website that you see at the bottom is 10 awesome like picture ways. Is it GIFs or is it GIFs?
I always say GIFs.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not cool enough to know all the lingo like that. So that website has some really cool ones. I've put a couple up there. But when we get to the point of explaining what breathing's all about, because they should know why deep breathing works, there's definitely different ways we can do it. And I love the object ones. So you'll see those cotton balls. We have students who's that connection to breathing. The language of telling kids to breathe isn't there. So we have to actually train the language of when somebody says, take a breath, what's that actually mean? Having actual physical objects to be able to move, help out. So one step back for a student who won't copy you. So if you got a kid who won't imitate and go, like do this and blow the cotton ball, using empty, not full, but empty, like ketchup things, and going breathe right next to them and having that language piece happen in practice until they start doing the actual action. So for those who have students who struggle with actual physical imitation, we can even back those things up to work on something like breathing and modeling it and making it part of our system. But I do like the GIFs.
And I think it's important when we talk about modeling that we understand that it's essential to model what's going to really functionally calm. So we often will be like, okay, let's go ahead and take a deep breath and let it out. Well, so a series of those kinds of breaths, it's going to cause hyperventilation and it's an alerting thing, which is not our goal most of the time. But nice inhale for a count of 2 to 3, a slow exhale for 4 to 6, that's going to be calming. You guys, this is deeply neurological. It is your vagus nerve. It is getting nice and regulated, and it runs right through the center of your body. So these are the things that have a core calming effect on anybody if they're able to access that particular calming strategy.
Self-monitoring is a great one when you have the student has the language skills and the cognitive and the executive functioning skills to be able to monitor self. And there's lots of layers to this where even when they don't self-monitor correctly, we're actually getting something out of it. It's still pretty huge to paying attention, because what it does, it makes you pay attention to your own self. And so when you're doing that, you get to make the decision on making an adjustment on those things that aren't in crisis mode, right? In crisis mode, that's totally different. Your brain is pretty much taken over and you've got little to no conscious thought going on there in different layers. But when we're in different layers of understanding how much I get out of my chair or how much I need to be touching, like all the different things that might be what people call sensory issues. When you have a child who can cognitively take a minute and pay attention to that, self-monitoring is a great evidence-based practice that you can follow a module. There's actually a couple modules out there, but the IRIS model module is pretty good to teach you how to have a child self-monitor, because it's not just as easy as you did this or you didn't, right? A lot of people think, oh, it's like check and check out. I did it or not. No, it's not. Check and check out is a self-monitoring system, but self-monitoring itself and the evidence-based practice is very layered, and you need to understand them all. Like the fact that a child can mislabel everything and still be progressing forward in the purpose and the goal you have, which is paying attention to self. So when I think about sensory differences and the things that we call that, which we now truly know that where we can affect things is regulation. We need to get kids knowing about their own body and how it works and how it shows up in the world that they live in. And so self-monitoring is a great evidence-based practice, because our goal is to work ourselves out of a job, because I'm going to assume most of you that are watching this are within the educational system, if not within the special educational IDEA side of things. And so we really need to be thinking about how are they moving forward without us, and they need to be the primal causal agent of their life to whatever extent that can be. They're the ones making the choices without the influence of others. That's our goal. And what are the things that we can affect and do right now? Student-driven IEPs, right? So when you go to fill that supplementary aids and services page, are we actually going from what student wants and student needs, right? So we might have data that they can use all this stuff and it's effective, but is it something that matches them? They believe it matches them, right? So the kid that never uses their math chart, because they're not going to pull a math chart in the middle of and everybody see it. Well, great, I'm glad it would work for them, but does it match them? No. We find a different way, and we discuss different ways, and we find different ways either to make it universal so it's not marginalizing because they need it there and there's no way to replace it, or we find different methods to do it and we get creative and we start asking around. You can make a 3-year-old a part of their IEP just by showing their picture before you start. It's always about that individual, and as much as you can have them involved is how much you have them involved. I love it when high school teachers don't write an IEP, the kid writes their IEP. Right. And so it's a discussion and it's a building process. That's what it's supposed to be, not this hour-long thing where one person wrote the whole thing and read it out, which, believe me, I did for years. But when we think about what is our actual goal here to make these kids college, career, and community ready, it takes us not being a huge part of it anymore and then taking onus of it. Teaching the kids about how their brain works. I have a whole training just on that, because if they're not understanding how their body shows up, how are they going to navigate it through anything outside of when they've got the co-regulator people taken and they're gone, right? Or we're down to just our parents or our family members. So when you empower a child with teaching them about their brain and how it works and how their body works, and that they're not their behavior, their body is, that's just a reaction their body had, it has so much power moving forward and making that child more self-determined and more of a self-advocate. And then key, which is also a part of self-monitoring, self-selected goals. We are not deciding where this child goes in their life. Them and their family are. And if we're not having them understanding that they have goals that they want to meet, and then showing them how we help you access, engage, and progress through those, we are missing out. And I'm not talking about IEP goals. I'm talking, well, I am actually in one layer form. It is IEP goals, but I'm just talking about being able to have a child identify a goal and then see the steps to go get to it, right? That in its wrapping up self is self-determination, to be able to set a goal, understand how your body sets it up, and then put a system in place to make it happen. Okay. That's in my mind, self-determination. And whatever piece we can get to, the child who is communicating by looking up left, right? And I just get a head nod, has a next step. Just like the kid who is writing their own IEP. Everybody has a next step. Whatever it is for them is where we start. So I'm hoping not only that you didn't turn us off yet, but that there is at least one thing that you heard today that you can enhance, change, or take out of your practice to move you forward. And I want you to commit to making a change. And if you had nothing, if not, you were like, Katie, I could have done this training, email me. I'll have a more deep conversation with you. I don't want you leaving these things. And I think Carm would agree with me.
Absolutely.
We don't put these things together to bore you to death. We want you to get at least something out of it, or at least language to be able to talk to other people about it. So if you came through this and you're like, I knew everything you said, but I found a new way to talk about it with others, that's great. Because one of the major issues we have in communicating with others, me being a special education teacher and OT, and Carm being an OT, is that we don't match sometimes, but we do match. So we're all coming for this kid, but we don't know how to talk the talk. So I'm hoping in having Carm with me today, and having the special education piece too, that we can merge some of this language to be able to move forward. So even if you knew all the content, being able to have a better conversation with your colleagues, I hope could be a goal for you. But the idea is, take the time. When you turn this off, don't go to the next one. Don't take the time to take a breath, You don't have to. I encourage you to take a breath or take a drink. Reflect on what you learned today, because if you don't take the time to reflect, it's not actually going to integrate into your brain. If you don't actually make a choice and challenge yourself to move forward on something, this was a fun thing to I hope it was a fun thing to listen to for an hour and a half, but it's not going to make impact. I want you to make impact. So take the time to reflect and make sure you know that you have resources out there, that it doesn't have to live and die right here with this one thing. I know most of us love the OTPT conference we go to every year, or we go to our the autism conference every year, right? And we go and we listen to all these things. But the Department of Public Instruction actually has a lot of really good resources, especially through our IDA discretionary grants, which is what the Supporting Neurodiverse Students grant is, to be able to support you after these trainings, to give you conversations. So find the people that you can collaborate with within your building. Think about who your people are. Now, this one I want to mention that we have a community practice through the Department of Public Instruction that's meant for related service providers like OTs, PTs, and speech pathologists. But it's not limited to you, to those people. We can all go to these things and have conversations like we are having today. And that you can find that in the link that you have there. That not only at the consultant level at DPI, you have those pieces, but you have things like the SNSWI.com website. You have our conferences that you go to. Don't let it live and die in one thing. Find something you want to be able to talk to somebody else about and make a part of your practice. Again, if you're like, hey, I got nothing out of this, email me. And if you have a really good question, I might even actually record an answer and put it up on the website. So if you're like, oh, I really wish everybody knew about this, fake it and say it's a question and email me and I will record an answer to you. Or I will actually say, hey, let's meet about this and we'll talk on Zoom. That's one thing. I know Karin still currently works inside a school district, but I literally am paid to be here for you. So all you have to do is email and say, I've got this, and I will find a path, whether it's a path with me or a path with somebody else. Don't stay stuck. If you can't find collaborators within your building, the state provides a lot for you. And I want you to know that you have access to that. And if you have no idea how to access any of it, email me and I'll tell you. Okay. So please come join us again. I'm hoping this got you something. I am so glad that I was able to show you how we should be doing this when it talks about sensory, that you need to have somebody who is trained in the area working the system with you. Otherwise, we're not really truly showing up if you want to think about it in the bucket of sensory. And that regulation is key.
You guys, thank you so much for your time and your attention today. If you do have any questions, feel free to email Katie first. If it's specific more so to occupational therapy or something that you feel you'd like me to elaborate on, my personal email has been shared. Feel free to connect with me in that way. It has been a privilege to present with you again.
I know, it's always so fun.
I know.
All right, have a good rest. Enjoy the rest of whatever you came across this within, whether it's the website or a conference. I encourage you to keep learning. So have a good one, guys.